June 16, 1943, 4 o'clock in the morning. Captain Jay Zeamer pulls back on the yoke, and old 666 lifts away from 7 Mile Strip in Port Moresby, her 4 Wright Cyclone engines cutting through the pre-dawn darkness over New Guinea. The bomber climbs into black sky, headed northeast across 600 miles of open Pacific toward Bougainville. Zeamer knows what waits there. Japanese fighter squadrons, no escort, no backup, just his crew, their cameras, and a mission the brass won't order anyone to fly. Inside the cockpit, sweat already beading despite the cold at altitude, Zeamer runs through what he and his crew have done to this aircraft. The B-17E they salvaged from the boneyard 3 months ago barely resembles a standard flying fortress anymore. Where Boeing installed 1350 caliber machine guns across various models, old 666 bristles with 19, twin guns in each waist position instead of singles, twin 50s in the radio compartment overhead. A custom-mounted gun in the nose that Zeamer can fire himself from the pilot's seat, bore-sighted to a line of rivets on the windshield because there's no proper sight. His crew stripped 2,000 pounds of weight from the airframe and installed 4 new engines. This isn't just modification, this is transformation born from the hard mathematics of survival in the Pacific theater. The mathematics were brutal and simple. A standard B-17 in the Pacific, encountering Japanese fighters, had perhaps a 30% chance of returning if caught alone. The Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter could outturn, outclimb, and outmaneuver any bomber in the sky. It could sustain 3 times the flight duration of comparable American fighters. Its 20mm cannon could tear through aluminum skin like paper. And Japanese pilots in mid-1943 still possessed the training and experience that made them among the most dangerous aviators in any theater of war. The Zero had earned its reputation honestly. When it first appeared over China in 1940, it achieved kill ratios of 12-1. At Pearl Harbor over the Philippines, across the Dutch East Indies, Zero pilots had systematically destroyed everything the Allies put into the air. The aircraft combined impossible contradictions. It weighed barely 4,000 pounds empty, less than half the weight of American fighters like the Wildcat. Yet it carried 2 20mm cannon and 2 7.7mm machine guns. Its Nakajima Sakai engine gave it a combat radius of over 1,000 miles with drop tanks. It could sustain a climb rate that seemed to defy physics and execute turning maneuvers that would stall any other aircraft at comparable speeds. American pilots who survived encounters with Zeros in early 1942 reported something that sounded like mythology. The Zero could flip into a climbing loop from level flight. It could execute what pilots called a square loop, using side slips out of turns to tighten the radius beyond what aerodynamics suggested was possible. It could hang on its propeller at angles where American fighters would spin and tumble. This wasn't exaggeration. This was engineering optimized for a single purpose: air superiority through maneuverability. But that optimization came with costs the Japanese had accepted as necessary trade-offs. The Zero carried no armor protection for the pilot. Its fuel tanks were not self-sealing. The airframe, built to minimize weight, would disintegrate under sustained gunfire. The hydraulics controlling ailerons and rudder lacked boosting, making the aircraft increasingly difficult to maneuver above 200 knots. And the float-type carburetor would cut out under negative G-forces, giving American pilots who learned the right tactics a crucial advantage: dive at high speed, roll hard right, and the Zero couldn't follow. By June 1943, some American pilots knew these weaknesses. But knowledge didn't guarantee survival when outnumbered 20-1, and that was exactly what Zeamer was flying toward. The Pacific Air War had evolved into something fundamentally different from the European theater. In Europe, B-17s flew in massive formations, boxes of aircraft stacked vertically and horizontally, so that overlapping fields of fire from dozens of bombers created zones of mutual protection. A German fighter attacking a tight formation faced concentrated fire from multiple aircraft simultaneously. The flying fortress concept worked because the fortresses weren't alone. In the Pacific, there were no such formations. Distances were too vast, targets too dispersed, bomber groups too small. B-17s flew singly or in pairs deep into Japanese-controlled territory without the protective umbrella of massed firepower. When Zeros appeared, bombers had only their own guns and the skill of their crews. By mid-1943, the Air Force was already replacing B-17s with B-24 Liberators, whose longer range better suited Pacific operations. The Flying Fortress was becoming obsolete in this theater, maintained primarily for specialized reconnaissance missions exactly like the one Zeamer was flying now. That mission was straightforward in concept, nearly suicidal in execution. Allied command needed detailed photographic mapping of Bougainville's west coast, specifically Empress Augusta Bay, where Marine amphibious forces would land in November. The mapping required a 22-minute run at 25,000 feet, flying absolutely straight and level to prevent photo blurring. 22 minutes during which the aircraft would be a perfect target, unable to maneuver, predictable as a metronome. And because V Bomber Command had added a last-minute requirement to also photograph Buka Airfield on Bougainville's northern tip, Zeamer would be announcing his presence to every Japanese fighter squadron in the area before beginning the vulnerable mapping run. Zeamer had told the operations officer no twice. He had planned this mission for 2 months, calculating fuel loads, mapping routes, preparing his crew. The Buka reconnaissance was a death sentence added casually by staff officers who wouldn't be in the aircraft. But as dawn approached, and Zeamer turned northeast toward Bougainville, he reconsidered. His navigator Ruby Johnston and the rest of the crew had discussed it. They were already flying 600 miles into the heart of Japanese-controlled waters. They were already committed. If they were going to do this mission, they should do it completely. At 0640 hours, Old 666 approached Buka Island from the northeast. In the grey dawn light, Zeamer could see the airstrip clearly, a crushed coral runway stretching half a mile, surrounded by earthen revetments carved from jungle. Aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip. His belly gunner, Forrest Dillman, counted them through the lower observation port, more than 20 Zeros visible, then more taking off, engines roaring as they lifted away from the runway. These were aircraft from the 251st Kokutai, elite naval fighter squadron normally based at Rabaul, but moved to Buka the previous day for a planned strike on Guadalcanal. Instead, a lone B-17 had appeared over their base at dawn, photographing their positions, counting their strength. It was an insult that demanded response. Second Lieutenant Joseph Sarnowski, bombardier and nose gunner, watched the Zeros lift off through his plexiglass position. He was 29 years old, commissioned just a month earlier after serving as an enlisted bombardier. Meticulous, precise, utterly focused on his instruments and his guns. He had helped install the twin 50 calibers that now pointed forward from the nose, replacing the single 30 caliber machine gun that standard B-7Es carried. Those guns gave Old 666 something no Japanese pilot expected, devastating forward firepower. The Japanese tactic for attacking B-117s had been perfected over 2 years of combat. The bomber's weakest defensive point was the nose. Tail guns could traverse wide arcs, waist guns covered the beam, ball turret covered the belly, top turret protected the dorsal approach. But the nose, with its bombardier's plexiglass enclosure and limited gun positions, was vulnerable. German pilots had learned to make head-on attacks in Europe. Japanese pilots had independently developed the same tactic in the Pacific. Come in fast from 12 o'clock high, concentrate fire on the cockpit and nose, break away before the bomber's gunners could track effectively. Zeamer watched the Zeros climb, circling to gain altitude advantage. He had perhaps 10 minutes before they reached Old 666's altitude of 25,000 feet. He turned south, beginning the mapping run down Bougainville's west coast. Photographer George Kendrick activated the Trimetrogon camera array, 3 synchronized cameras that would capture overlapping images of the coastline below. 22 minutes of straight, level flight. The cameras required it. The mission required it. And now, with 17 or 18 Japanese fighters climbing toward them, survival would require something else entirely. At 0740 hours, with 22 minutes of the mapping run remaining, the first Zeros reached Old 666's altitude. They circled the bomber just beyond machine gun range, 4,000 yards out, studying this lone American aircraft, coordinating their attack. Zeamer kept the B-17 steady. Kendrick's cameras were running. The mission wasn't complete. Then the Zeros attacked. Not the cautious, probing passes American crews had seen earlier in the war. a coordinated assault, multiple fighters attacking simultaneously from different vectors. 2 Zeros came in from behind where the tail guns would engage. 3 more fanned across the front, preparing for head-on runs. The tactic was designed to overwhelm defensive fire, to create too many targets for gunners to track, to ensure at least some fighters would get clean shots at the cockpit. The first Zero came head-on, closing at combined speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. The pilot expected to find minimal nose armament, perhaps a single flexible gun that the bombardier would struggle to aim during the brief seconds of approach. Instead, he met concentrated fire from twin 50-caliber machine guns, along with the fixed gun that Zeamer triggered from his pilot's yoke. The convergence of firepower at close range was devastating. The Zero disintegrated, pieces tumbling past old 666's wings. A second Zero pressed the attack. Sarnowski's twin guns tracked it, firing in precise bursts. The Japanese pilot, seeing his wingman destroyed, fired his 20mm cannon as he closed. Shells impacted the nose plexiglass and cockpit. Sarnowski was hit by shrapnel, thrown back from his guns. Zeamer took multiple hits in his arms and legs, one round shattering his leg bone. The Zero flashed past, trailing smoke from Sarnowski's return fire, then fell away in a descending spiral. The mathematics of air combat are written in milliseconds and inches. A 50-caliber round exits the barrel at 2,900 feet per second. The M2 Browning machine gun fires at roughly 800 rounds per minute, though crews learn to fire in bursts to prevent overheating. At convergence range, typically 300 yards, the cone of fire from multiple guns creates a kill zone through which aircraft cannot pass intact. The Zero's lightweight construction, optimized for maneuverability, meant it could not absorb this punishment. Aluminum skin would peel away, control surfaces would shred. The unarmored pilot would be exposed to rounds that could penetrate an inch of steel plate. But the Zero's 20mm cannon was equally devastating. Each explosive shell carried 19 grams of high explosive. On impact, the shell would detonate, sending shrapnel through the target in a cone of destruction. Against the B-17's heavier construction, a single 20mm hit might damage but not destroy. But concentrated fire could tear through engines, sever control cables, puncture fuel tanks, and kill crew members. The Zero carried 60 rounds per cannon. Japanese pilots trained to fire in short, accurate bursts, making every round count. Sarnowski crawled back from his guns, blood spreading across the nose compartment floor. The bombardier navigator tried to provide first aid, but more Zeros were attacking, and the mission wasn't complete. Sarnowski looked at the cameras, still running, looked at the approaching fighters, pulled himself back to his gun position and resumed firing. Zeamer, bleeding from multiple wounds, his broken leg useless, continued to pilot old 666 with his hands alone. He had developed a defensive tactic specifically for this scenario. When Japanese fighters attacked from the front, he would bank hard inside their firing angle, simultaneously avoiding their gunfire and allowing his rear-facing gunners clear shots as the Zeros passed. It required split-second timing, precise control, and absolute trust in his crew's gunnery. One mistake and the bomber would stall, or the Zeros would pour cannon fire into the cockpit at point-blank range. The second wave came. More Zeros, having observed the destruction of the first wave, adjusted their tactics. They attacked from above, diving through the B-17's altitude, firing as they came. One burst struck the oxygen system. At 25,000 feet, the crew needed supplemental oxygen to function. Without it, they had perhaps 30 seconds of useful consciousness before hypoxia would render them helpless. Zeamer pushed the yoke forward. Old 666 dropped, engines screaming as the bomber descended at emergency speed. 15,000 feet in seconds. The altimeter had been destroyed by gunfire, so Zeamer calculated altitude from manifold pressure changes, a technique he had learned as an MIT engineering graduate before the war. At 10,000 feet, where the crew could breathe without supplemental oxygen, he pulled out of the dive, leveling the aircraft. The Zeros followed, continuing their attacks. But now Zeamer could execute his defensive technique fully. As each fighter lined up for a head-on pass, he would bank old 666 hard inside their firing angle. The Zero pilot, committed to the attack run at high speed, couldn't adjust quickly enough. His guns would fire wide. Then he would flash past the B-17's beam, where tail gunner Herbert Pugh and waist gunners had clear shots with no deflection, just pure tracking. The Zero's vulnerability in high-speed maneuvers, its stiff ailerons and limited armor, made it easy prey for disciplined gunners once it committed to an attack run. This continued for 40 minutes. Wave after wave of attacks. Zeros circling, diving, making runs from every angle. Old 666's gunners firing in disciplined bursts, conserving ammunition, tracking targets through their sights. The bomber's aluminum skin was being progressively shredded. Over 200 holes would later be counted, 5 20mm cannon hits, 1 engine damaged, control cables severed. But the airframe held together and the crew kept fighting. Radio operator William Vaughan took a round to the neck, a grazing wound that left him bleeding but functional. He calculated a heading to WWII, an Allied airstrip on Papua's eastern coast, closer than Port Moresby and not requiring flight over the Owen Stanley Range, which Zeamer probably couldn't manage in his condition. Flight engineer Johnny Abel and top turret gunner William Vaughan extinguished an oxygen fire in the fuselage using only their hands and rags, sustaining burns but preventing the fire from spreading to fuel tanks. Sarnowski, still at his guns despite his wounds, spotted another fighter making an approach. Not a Zero this time, a twin-engine Mitsubishi Ki-46, Dyna reconnaissance aircraft, pressed into combat because every available Japanese aircraft in the area had been scrambled to destroy this single American bomber. Sarnowski tracked it, fired a burst. The Dyna fell away. Sarnowski collapsed over his guns. By 0845 hours, the Japanese fighters broke off. They were low on fuel, low on ammunition, unable to penetrate old 666's defensive fire. The bomber had survived, 6 crew members wounded or dead, the aircraft shot to pieces, but the cameras had kept running. The mission was complete. Zeamer had lost consciousness from blood loss. Co-pilot First Lieutenant John Britton took control, nursing the damaged bomber toward WWII. The flaps were inoperable, the brakes were destroyed. Britain would have to land on a 6,000-foot runway and stop a 20-ton aircraft through ground loop alone. He brought old 666 in carefully, touched down, let the aircraft roll until near the runway's end, then deliberately ground looped to bleed off remaining speed. The B-17 slewed sideways and stopped. Ground crews rushed forward and found Zeamer unconscious. Blood pooled around the cockpit floor. They assumed he was dead. Britain told them to check again. Zeamer was alive, barely. Sarnowski was dead. He had continued fighting from his guns after being wounded, had shot down multiple Japanese aircraft, had completed the mapping mission even as he bled out in the nose compartment. He would receive the Medal of Honor posthumously. Zeamer, against all medical probability, would survive his wounds and also receive the Medal of Honor. Every other crew member received the Distinguished Service Cross. It was the most heavily decorated single mission in Air Force history. The photographs they captured would be essential to the November invasion of Bougainville. Marines landing at Empress Augusta Bay had detailed maps of coastal defenses, reef systems, and Japanese positions because old 666 had flown that 22-minute mapping run under continuous attack. The invasion would succeed, pushing Japanese forces back, cutting their supply lines, and contributing to the eventual Allied victory in the Solomon Islands campaign. But the mission's significance extended beyond tactical intelligence. Old 666 represented a fundamental challenge to Japanese assumptions about American bomber vulnerabilities. The standard B-17E carried 1350 caliber machine guns distributed across multiple positions. Japanese pilots had learned to exploit the gaps in this defensive coverage, particularly the weak forward armament. A lone bomber encountering multiple fighters would be overwhelmed, unable to bring sufficient firepower to bear on all attackers simultaneously. Zeamer and his crew had systematically addressed each vulnerability. They studied Japanese tactics, analyzed attack patterns, and modified their aircraft specifically to counter Zero capabilities. The twin guns in each waist position increased beam defensive fire. The fixed nose gun gave the pilot direct offensive capability during head-on attacks. The weight reduction improved speed and climb rate, letting old 666 maintain altitude and position better than standard B-17s. The new engines provided power margins for emergency maneuvers. This wasn't just mechanical modification. This was tactical innovation at the crew level. born from understanding that survival required more than following standard procedures. The Air Force bureaucracy had rejected old 666, parking it as too damaged to repair, too unlucky to fly. Zeamer saw an opportunity. He and his crew rebuilt the aircraft themselves, without official support, using scrounged parts and improvised techniques. They created the most heavily armed B-17 in the Pacific Theater, not because they were ordered to, but because they understood what was necessary to survive the missions they volunteered to fly. The engagement revealed something else about the Zero's declining effectiveness by mid-1943. While the aircraft retained its extraordinary maneuverability, while Japanese pilots still possessed considerable skill, the combination of improved American tactics and better understanding of the Zero's limitations was eroding its dominance. The captured Akutan Zero, recovered intact in Alaska in mid-1942, had been extensively tested at Naval Air Station North Island and elsewhere. The tests revealed specific weaknesses: stiff ailerons above 200 knots, inability to roll right effectively at high speed, carburetor cutout during negative G maneuvers, lack of armor and self-sealing tanks. This information had been disseminated to American fighter squadrons, allowing pilots to develop boom and zoom tactics that exploited the Zero's vulnerabilities while avoiding its strengths. But bomber crews had less opportunity to use these insights. A B-17 couldn't outdive a Zero in a hit-and-run attack. It had to absorb punishment and maintain formation. What Zeamer demonstrated was that with sufficient firepower and skilled defensive flying, a bomber could survive and even prevail against overwhelming fighter opposition. Japanese records, examined after the war, show a different story from the crew's immediate combat reports. Old 666's gunners claimed 5 Zeros shot down. Japanese documentation indicates no aircraft were shot down during the engagement, though one ditched due to engine failure and 3 sustained damage from defensive fire. 2 Zero pilots from the attacking squadron, Warrant Officer Yoshio Oki and Flight Petty Officer 2nd Class Suehiro Yamamoto, failed to return from a strike on Allied shipping at Lunga Point later that same day, suggesting they may have been damaged during the old 666 engagement and subsequently lost. This discrepancy between American claims and Japanese records was common throughout the war. In the chaos of air combat, multiple gunners might fire at the same target, each believing they scored the kill. An aircraft trailing smoke might appear to be fatally damaged when it actually recovered. Confirmation was nearly impossible when combat occurred hundreds of miles from base, over open ocean, with no way to verify wreckage. What's not disputable is that old 666 survived an engagement that should have destroyed it. 17 to 18 Japanese fighters, among the best trained pilots still operational in the theater, attacked a lone bomber for 40 minutes and failed to shoot it down. The B-17 returned with 6 crew members wounded or killed, but it returned. The mission was completed, the intelligence was gathered. The aircraft itself, after repairs that reversed many of the Eager Beaver's modifications, returned to service with the 8th Photo Reconnaissance Squadron. It flew additional combat missions before being transferred back to the United States in March 1944 for use as a transport and training aircraft. In August 1945, old 666 was flown to Albuquerque, New Mexico, and sold for scrap. The most heavily armed B-17 in the Pacific Theater, the aircraft that survived the longest recorded aerial dogfight in Air Force history, was reduced to raw aluminum for post-war industrial production. The tactical lessons from the mission influenced bomber modifications throughout the remaining war. The B-7G model, introduced in late 1943, incorporated a chin turret with twin 50-caliber guns, specifically to address frontal attack vulnerability. This addition, testing of which had begun before old 666's mission but was validated by it, became standard on all subsequent Flying Fortress production. The idea that bombers needed enhanced forward firepower, not just defensive coverage, became accepted doctrine. But the deeper significance lies in what the mission revealed about individual initiative within military structures. Zeamer was not a model officer. He volunteered for missions constantly, earning his crew the nickname Eager Beavers, but also creating friction with command structures that valued predictable execution over aggressive initiative. He had been passed over for bomber command because other captains didn't want his crew. He requisitioned a damaged aircraft from the scrap heap without official authorization. He modified it extensively without formal approval. He rejected orders from operations officers when he believed those orders would compromise mission success. In a more rigid military structure, Zeamer would have been disciplined, possibly removed from flight status. Instead, he and his crew achieved what formal planning and standard procedures couldn't. They completed a mission deemed nearly suicidal, gathered intelligence critical to future operations, demonstrated that American bombers could survive against Japanese fighter opposition, and proved that individual innovation at the crew level could overcome systemic limitations. The Pacific Air War in 1943 was reaching an inflection point. Japanese pilot training programs were deteriorating as experienced instructors were pulled into combat roles to fill losses. New pilots received increasingly abbreviated training, sometimes as little as a few months before deployment. American pilot training, conversely, was expanding, with new schools producing thousands of aviators annually, each receiving extensive instruction before deployment. The material advantage was even more stark. American factories were producing aircraft at rates the Japanese couldn't match. For every Zero built, American factories produced 5 or 6 fighters and bombers. This industrial and training asymmetry meant that by late 1943, American forces could absorb losses and continue operations, while Japanese forces faced irreplaceable attrition. Each experienced pilot lost, each aircraft destroyed, weakened Japanese capabilities in ways that couldn't be quickly remedied. The Zero that was invincible in 1941 was becoming obsolete by 1943, not because the aircraft had changed, but because the entire context of air combat had evolved. American fighters like the F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair were designed specifically to exploit Zero vulnerabilities. American pilots learned tactics that neutralized Zero advantages. And American industrial capacity ensured numerical superiority that made individual aircraft performance less decisive. Old 6I-66's mission occurred at this transitional moment. It demonstrated that even the feared Zero could be defeated by proper tactics, adequate firepower, and skilled crews. It showed that American innovation at the individual level could match or exceed Japanese tactical sophistication. And it proved that the B-17, despite being phased out of Pacific service, could still achieve mission success against overwhelming opposition when crewed by determined aviators who refused to accept conventional limitations. Zeamer spent a year recovering from his wounds. His broken leg required multiple surgeries. The shrapnel wounds across his body left permanent scars, but he survived, returned to duty, and eventually retired from the Air Force as a lieutenant colonel. He rarely spoke about the mission, deflecting attention to his crew, particularly to Sarnowski, who had died at his guns. When asked about the Medal of Honor, Zeamer said simply that they had done what the mission required, nothing more, nothing less. That understated response captures something essential about the Pacific Air War. Crews like the Eager Beavers weren't fighting for glory or recognition. They were fighting because the missions needed to be flown, because intelligence needed to be gathered, because the war needed to be won. They modified aircraft because standard configurations weren't adequate. They volunteered for impossible missions because someone had to fly them. They continued fighting when wounded because the mission wasn't complete. The transformation of the B-17 from vulnerable target to survivable weapons platform wasn't the result of engineering genius at Boeing or tactical innovation from Air Force headquarters. It emerged from crew-level improvisation, from mechanics and pilots who understood their aircraft intimately and modified them to meet specific threats. It demonstrated that military innovation doesn't always flow from top-down planning. Sometimes it emerges from the bottom up, from individuals who refuse to accept that things must be done a certain way because that's how they've always been done. The June 16, 1943 mission became legendary precisely because it seemed impossible. A lone bomber, deep in enemy territory, attacked by elite fighter squadrons, surviving through firepower and skill that conventional wisdom said couldn't exist. Japanese pilots who attacked Old 666 that morning expected an easy kill. They found something else. An aircraft bristling with guns, a crew that fought with disciplined intensity, a pilot who could maneuver a 4-engine bomber like a fighter, and a determination that wouldn't accept defeat even when defeat seemed certain. When the war ended, when historians began analyzing Pacific air combat, the old 666 mission appeared in studies of bomber defensive tactics, in analyses of zero combat effectiveness, in examinations of the transition from Japanese air superiority to American dominance. The mission became data point and legend simultaneously, factual record and mythic narrative, evidence that individual courage and innovation could overcome systemic disadvantages. The B-17 Flying Fortress was designed as a weapon of strategic bombardment, a platform for destroying industrial targets deep in enemy territory through precision daylight attacks. In European skies, B-17s flew in massive formations, dropping thousands of tons of ordnance on German factories, marshalling yards and oil refineries. That was the vision behind the aircraft's development, the purpose for which it was optimized. But in Pacific skies, the B-17 became something else. It became a reconnaissance platform, flying alone into hostile airspace to gather intelligence. It became a maritime patrol aircraft, searching vast ocean expanses for Japanese fleets. It became, in the hands of crews like Zeamer's, a fighting aircraft that could give as good as it got in aerial combat. The transformation wasn't planned. It emerged from necessity, from the specific demands of Pacific operations, from crews who adapted standard equipment to non-standard missions. Old 666's survival stands as testament to what determined individuals could achieve with inadequate resources and impossible odds. It demonstrates that technological advantage isn't absolute, that tactical skill and crew coordination can overcome raw performance disparities, that innovation at the operational level can be as decisive as innovations in design or production. The mission succeeded not because American industry outproduced Japan, though it did, not because American aircraft were superior, though increasingly they were. The mission succeeded because 9 men refused to accept that the mission was impossible, modified their aircraft to improve survival odds, developed tactics specifically for the threat they faced, and then executed those tactics with precision under sustained attack. That determination, replicated across thousands of crews, in thousands of missions, ultimately decided the Pacific Air War. The Japanese bet on qualitative superiority, better pilots, better tactics, aircraft optimized for specific combat scenarios. The Americans bet on quantitative superiority, more aircraft, more pilots, more missions, accepting higher individual losses because overall capacity allowed sustained operations despite attrition. But what made the American approach work wasn't just the numbers. It was the ability of individual crews to learn, adapt, and innovate, to take standard equipment and make it work in non-standard ways, to accomplish missions that planning staffs thought were suicidal. Zeamer and his crew proved that a B-17, properly modified and expertly flown, could survive attacks from multiple Zero fighters. They proved that bomber crews could fight back effectively against the most feared fighter in the Pacific. They proved that missions deemed too dangerous to order could be flown successfully by volunteers willing to accept the risk. And they proved that the transformation from defensive victim to aggressive survivor didn't require revolutionary new technology. It required understanding the enemy's capabilities, modifying equipment to counter those capabilities, and executing tactics with disciplined skill. The photographs old 666 captured that day were analyzed by intelligence staff, distributed to invasion planning teams, and incorporated into operational orders for the Bougainville landing. Marines wading ashore in November 1943 had detailed maps of their landing zones because a single bomber crew had flown 22 minutes of straight and level photography while under sustained attack. They had information about Japanese defensive positions because Zeamer had decided to add the Buka reconnaissance despite orders not to. They had intelligence about fighter squadron strength because the crew had counted aircraft on the ground before those aircraft took off to attack them. Strategic success often depends on tactical intelligence gathered under conditions that seem to preclude gathering any intelligence at all. The grand campaigns, the theater-wide operations, the multi-division assaults all depend on knowing where the enemy is, what forces they have, what terrain features exist. Reconnaissance provides that knowledge. But reconnaissance in wartime means flying into enemy airspace, deliberately making yourself a target, staying exposed long enough to gather the required information, and then escaping to deliver that information to forces that can use it. Old 666's crew did exactly that. They flew 600 miles into Japanese-controlled territory. They photographed a major enemy airfield. They executed a 22-minute mapping run while under continuous attack. They survived 40 minutes of aerial combat against vastly superior numbers. They brought their aircraft back despite catastrophic damage. They delivered intelligence that directly enabled a successful amphibious operation 3 months later. And they demonstrated that American bomber crews, even in obsolescent aircraft, could complete missions that Japanese forces couldn't prevent. The Zero pilots who attacked Old 666 that morning were experienced, skilled aviators flying one of the war's most capable fighters. They had numerical superiority, tactical position, and the advantage of attacking a lone bomber far from any support. Under any reasonable analysis, they should have destroyed the B-17 quickly and decisively. That they didn't reflects not their failure, but Old 666's exceptional capability, the result of months of crew-level modification and tactical development specifically designed for exactly this scenario. This is how transformations happen in warfare. Not through grand theories or revolutionary designs, but through incremental improvements, tactical adaptations, and individual innovations that accumulate into systemic advantages. American bomber crews learned that forward firepower mattered, that defensive tactics could be aggressive rather than passive, that survival wasn't just about absorbing punishment, but about fighting back effectively. The Zero, conversely, never evolved substantially during the war. It remained essentially the same aircraft in 1945 that it had been in 1941. Lightweight, maneuverable, long-ranged, but also unarmored, vulnerable, and increasingly outclassed by newer American designs. Japanese industry couldn't produce replacement aircraft fast enough to offset losses. Japanese training programs couldn't replace experienced pilots with equally skilled successors. And Japanese tactical doctrine, built around the Zero's specific capabilities, couldn't adapt quickly to changing combat conditions. By 1944, the Zero had become what one American fighter pilot described as cannon fodder, an aircraft that still flew but couldn't compete against Hellcats, Corsairs, and Lightnings. Experienced Zero pilots remained dangerous, but there were fewer of them every month, and the replacement pilots had only a fraction of their predecessors' training and experience. The aircraft that had dominated Pacific skies for 2 years became obsolete, not because it changed, but because everything around it changed. American tactics, American aircraft, American industrial capacity, and American crew skill levels. Old 666's mission occurred at the moment when that transformation was becoming visible. The invincible Zero could be defeated. The vulnerable B-17 could survive and fight back. The balance of air power was shifting, not through any single technological breakthrough, but through the accumulation of tactical improvements, training enhancements, and numerical advantages that American forces were systematically developing. In the end, war is decided by accumulation of such moments. Individual missions that succeed despite impossible odds. Crews that refuse to accept that their aircraft or tactics are inadequate. Innovations that emerge from operational necessity rather than theoretical planning. Old 666's survival didn't win the Pacific Air War, but it represented the kind of achievement that, multiplied across thousands of missions and hundreds of crews, did win that war. The B-17 Flying Fortress was supposed to be invulnerable through defensive firepower, a flying fortress that could protect itself without escort. That concept failed catastrophically in early European operations, where unescorted bombers suffered unsustainable losses until long-range fighters could provide protection. But in the Pacific, with different operational conditions and tactical requirements, crews like Zeamer's demonstrated that the concept could work if implemented correctly, not through standard configurations and standard tactics, but through aggressive modification and innovative execution. That lesson, that standard solutions aren't always adequate, that innovation at the operational level can overcome systemic limitations, that individual determination can achieve what formal planning dismisses as impossible, extends far beyond this single mission or even this single war. It speaks to how organizations adapt and overcome, how individuals within structures can drive transformation, how tactical necessity can produce strategic innovation. Captain Jay Zeamer and his crew took a damaged bomber from the scrap heap and transformed it into the most lethal defensive aircraft in the Pacific theater. They volunteered for a mission that offered perhaps one chance in 10 of survival. They modified their tactics in real time during 40 minutes of sustained combat. They completed their mission despite 6 crew members wounded or killed, and they proved that the B-17, properly employed, could survive and succeed against the fighter that had terrorized Allied aviators for 2 years. On June 16, 1943, Japanese pilots laughed at B-17 defenses because they had systematically destroyed those defenses in dozens of previous engagements. They attacked Old 666, expecting another easy kill. They found instead an aircraft and crew that fought back with unexpected ferocity, that couldn't be overwhelmed by numerical superiority, that completed their mission and escaped despite everything the Japanese could throw at them. That morning, perception changed. The invincible Zero wasn't invincible, the vulnerable B-17 wasn't helpless, and the balance of air power in the Pacific, already shifting, continued its inexorable movement toward American dominance. Not because of this single mission, but because this mission exemplified the transformation occurring across the entire theater, American crews learning, adapting, innovating, and refusing to accept that yesterday's defeats predetermined tomorrow's outcomes. Old 666 flew into history that day, but more importantly, its crew demonstrated something that echoes across decades, that courage combined with innovation, skill combined with determination, can overcome odds that seem insurmountable. That's not mythology, that's not exaggeration. That's what happened over Bougainville on June 16, 1943, when one Flying Fortress crew showed the world that they could fight back, survive, and win against everything the enemy could send against them.